Hello, welcome to the sixth and final week of our course. In this week, we will be covering the Civil War and Reconstruction. I look forward to working with you. During this week, you'll be asked to read two chapters from Boundless, chapters 15 and 16, and you will be asked to participate in a discussion board. The discussion board will ask you to comment upon the most profound legacy of the Civil War. You will also be asked to watch two short video clips. One video clip is a commentary by Eric Foner on his views on the most important legacy or aspects of the Civil War. Eric Foner is a prominent historian from Columbia University. And you'll also be asked to watch a video clip on the history of sharecroppers in the American South, the system of sharecropping. I'll address the topics covered in both of those videos in this introduction, and I'll also be speaking about the broader discussion board topic. Your second written assignment for this week is to write an essay. So rather than a blog post, you have a written essay assignment for this week. And this is the final essay for the course. It's a 5 to 6 page essay, double-spaced, and it can be about any topic in American history, from the founding of the first British North American colonies in 1607 up until the end of Reconstruction in 1877. So you can choose any topic in American history from 1607 up to 1877. It could be a person that you're interested in. It could be an important event that you're interested in. Really, it's quite broad and wide open, as you'll see in the instructions. So it's not very limited. You can choose almost any topic as long as it connects to American history during that broad time period of the course. And what you're asked to do is to formulate a thesis or argument related to some aspect of American history, and to identify 5 sources of information, articles, websites, that provide information about your topic, and to compose an essay in which you present an argument related to your chosen topic in American history. So I'd like to use this introductory video to briefly offer some commentary on both of these assignments, both the discussion board assignment and the essay assignment. So I'll start with the discussion board. So the discussion board topic asks you to comment on the most important legacy of the American Civil War. The American Civil War took place from 1861 to 1865, and it was the most devastating war in American history in terms of the sheer loss of life. Approximately 620,000 Americans died in the Civil War. It's the most number of Americans who were killed in any war in American history. And this was at a time when the population of the United States was only approximately 32 million people, about 10% of what the population of the United States is today. To reach an equivalent loss of life in terms of percentage today, approximately 6 million Americans would have to die in a war to equal, in terms of sheer percentage, the loss of life that was experienced with the 620,000 deaths in the Civil War. So it was a truly devastating war. Almost every American was touched by the Civil War directly in terms of having family members lose their lives or being seriously wounded in the war. And of course, it was a war that pitted the nation against itself. The Civil War begins with the secession of the southern states from the Union. Abraham Lincoln is elected President of the United States in November of 1860. He's the first member of the Republican Party to be elected president. The Republican Party was known as a party that was certainly opposed to the expansion of slavery, and Southerners viewed the Republican Party as being opposed to slavery itself. And there was fear amongst the supporters of slavery that the Republican Party was committed to the abolition of slavery. So there's tremendous fear amongst those in power in the South the sort of white establishment of the South, particularly the plantation owners of the South, that the election of Abraham Lincoln posed a threat to the institution of slavery. And hence, a number of states in the South, beginning with South Carolina, voted to secede from the Union, literally to no longer be part of the United States anymore. This sparked, of course, a constitutional crisis. Abraham Lincoln denied that any state had a right to leave the Union, and ultimately civil war erupted when the southern states formed their own nation, if you will, the Confederate States of America, drafted their own constitution, and opened fire on a federal fort in the South, commencing the Civil War. So the Civil War pitted the northern states of the United States against the southern states, the Union against the Confederacy, the free states, in many respects, against the slave states. One of the key issues of the Civil War clearly was slavery. Now, when Lincoln was first elected to office, he was not committed to abolishing slavery. I do think it's important to understand that. He was opposed to the expansion of slavery into any territories where it didn't already exist, but he wasn't calling for the abolition of slavery initially. And even in the early years of the Civil War, 1861, 1862, Lincoln was not calling for an end to slavery. However, as the war progressed, and as the loss of life mounted, and as the war became more bitter, eventually Lincoln came to embrace the cause of the abolition of slavery. In 1862, Lincoln issued an Emancipation Proclamation. This was essentially a warning to the South. The Emancipation Proclamation stated that if the South did not surrender and agree to rejoin the Union by January 1st, 1863, then all of the slaves in the Confederate States would be declared free now and forever going forward. So it was an ultimatum, basically, to the Confederacy. Either surrender now, or the Union would declare slavery abolished in the Confederacy forever. The Confederacy, of course, had no intention of surrendering, so on January 1st, the Emancipation Proclamation formally went into effect. Now, of course, the Union, practically speaking, did not have power over the Confederacy at this time. The Confederacy was in rebellion, so in effect, most slaves, very few slaves were actually, practically speaking, made free by the Emancipation Proclamation. So an enslaved person in Georgia, for example, the Emancipation Proclamation declared them a free person, but they were under the control of the Confederacy, so practically speaking, they were not yet free. As the Union Army advanced in the South, as the Union Army invaded southern states, slaves did gain their freedom. Enslaved persons took the initiative. They left their plantations, and they frequently moved to the Union lines and essentially claimed their own freedom by fleeing from the plantations and going towards the Union lines. Beginning in 1863, the Union started to recruit African Americans into the Union Army, and a number, thousands of African American soldiers would serve in the Union Army in the Civil War as well, and played an important role in the Union victory, certainly. Eventually, by April of 1865, the Union would achieve victory in the Civil War. The Confederate States would be defeated. And then began a long process that's known as Reconstruction. Reconstruction was the effort to reunite the nation after the Civil War. And Reconstruction is typically dated as the time period from 1865 to 1877. So it's a period of 12 years, trying to bring the country back together again, practically speaking. And it raised a lot of important questions. I think Reconstruction is one of the more important aspects of American history in many ways. One of the key questions surrounding Reconstruction was what would the status be of the freed slaves? Clearly they would be free persons, but what did that mean? Slavery would be abolished. That was made clear through the Emancipation Proclamation, issued in 1863. But the Emancipation Proclamation didn't say what the status of the freed slaves would be exactly. So this all had to be worked out. It would not be worked out under the leadership of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was assassinated at the end of the Civil War. He was killed by an actor, a rather famous actor named John Wilkes Booth, shot and killed Abraham Lincoln. He was one of the more famous actors in America at the time. He shot and killed Lincoln. He was a Southerner and was very opposed to the Union. And as a result, the vice president, Andrew Johnson, became president at this point. So the questions to be resolved in Reconstruction. One aspect of this, the status of the freed persons. Part of this involved the actions of the freed persons themselves. What actions would they take? One of the things that you see immediately after the Civil War is a mass migration of African Americans in the South. You might think they would move north, but that was generally not the case. There was not a large movement of African Americans north at the end of the Civil War. Rather, African Americans were moving across the South. You had large numbers of African Americans moving from the Deep South, from places like Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana, moving to the Upper South, places like Virginia and North Carolina. And the reason for this movement was largely family reunification. Over the course of the preceding years and decades, many enslaved African Americans, typically men, had been sold from the Upper South, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, to the Deep South, to Mississippi, Alabama, and had been separated from their family members, from their wives, children, etc. And now they were moving to try to reunite with their family members. You also saw a huge number of marriage ceremonies take place immediately following the Civil War amongst the freed slaves, African Americans. Slaves could technically not get married. They did marry in their own ceremonies, but these marriages were not recognized by law. Slaves legally could not marry. Their marriages had no binding force under law, and that's why husbands and wives could be separated and could be sold apart from each other. So once the Emancipation Proclamation practically took effect, you did see formal marriage ceremonies take place amongst African Americans in large numbers at this point. So there's a desire for family unification at the end of the Civil War. Slavery was formally abolished permanently by the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The 13th Amendment declared that slavery would be abolished permanently. Involuntary servitude was abolished. Additionally, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution was enacted. The 14th Amendment has a few important provisions. One aspect of the 14th Amendment is that all persons born in the United States are citizens of the United States. This is important because there is a question as to whether the freed slaves would be considered citizens of the United States or not. In an earlier Supreme Court case, the case of Dred Scott, the Supreme Court had ruled that no African American person, slave or free, could ever be considered a citizen of the United States. The 14th Amendment of the Constitution says any person, regardless of their race, born in the United States is, by definition, a citizen of the United States. So this essentially rendered virtually all of the freed slaves citizens of the United States. And of course, this law has important implications up to the present day, this amendment to the Constitution. It also, the 14th Amendment says all citizens of the United States must be treated equally under the law. Another amendment to the Constitution that was implemented as a result of the Civil War was the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. The 15th Amendment to the Constitution says that no one can be denied the right to vote on the basis of their race. Now, women did not yet have the right to vote. That doesn't come about until decades later, so at this point it applies only to men. But what it's saying is that no man can be denied the right to vote on the basis of his race. So this effectively would extend the right to vote to African American men. There were other small minority populations in the U.S. at this time, but African Americans were by far the largest racial minority group in the country at this point. Now, the Union Army occupied the South at this point. Literally, the South was under the control of the Union Army. The South was divided into 5 military zones of occupation under the control of Union Army generals. Now, by between 1868 and 1870, Southern states were allowed to reconstitute themselves and draft new constitutions. As part of this process, the Southern states had to agree to ratify the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution in order to rejoin the Union as states. So the Southern states rejoin the Union, they draft new constitutions, and they have to ratify the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and the Southern states have to grant African American men the right to vote. This process is completed between 1868 and 1870, depending on the state. And in the 1870s, African American men are politically empowered. In the 1870s, African American men have the right to vote. And they'd use the right to vote. African Americans are elected to various offices across the South. You have to remember, in many southern states, African Americans were close to or a majority of the population. States like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, you had very large African American populations. And you had, from the state of Mississippi, there were both of the senators from Mississippi were African American men elected to the United States Senate in the 1870s. You had congressmen elected, African American congressmen elected from many southern states. Almost every southern state had state legislators who were African American men at this point. And they did make very important contributions to reforming state laws and making them more fair and more just at this point. For example, African Americans were very influential African American legislators in creating the first public schools in the South. Prior to the Civil War, there were no public schools in the South. There were no public schools for whites, and there were no public schools for African Americans. If you wanted to have your child educated, you had to have enough money to send them to private school or hire a private tutor. It was African Americans who pushed for the opening of public schools in the South. So there were signs of progress taking place. African Americans in the South overwhelmingly supported the Republican Party. The Republican Party was the party that had pushed for the abolition of slavery. The Republican Party was the party that had pushed for the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. The amendments that abolished slavery, that declared that all people born in the United States were citizens in the United States, that all citizens should be treated equally, and that all people should have the right to vote regardless of their race. The Democratic Party at this time was deeply opposed to granting equal rights to African Americans. The Democratic Party had supported slavery. The Democratic Party was also at this time supporting the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan was a white supremacist terrorist group that emerged shortly after the Civil War. It was formed by former members of the Confederate Army who basically wanted to continue the Civil War after the conclusion of the war by other means. So the war had ended, but these were men who wanted to continue to pursue the goals of the Confederacy through terrorism, essentially, after the end of the conflict. And so the secret society, the Ku Klux Klan, was formed. It was committed to um, preserving, the white power structure in the South, and it became the sort of terrorist wing of the Democratic Party after the Civil War in the 1860s and 1870s. Now, in the period from 1865 to 1877, the Union Army was able to suppress the Ku Klux Klan because the Union Army was still occupying the South. And as a result, African Americans were able to vote and use their political power. And Republicans largely gained power over the South. You had Republican governors, Republican legislatures, and things were moving forward progressively in the South. The status and rights of African Americans were largely improving. There were problems, there were challenges. No one would claim, I think, that full equal rights had been established, certainly. But there were signs of progress. One of the great problems was a lack of land ownership. One of the great questions after the Civil War was what would happen to the land of those who had rebelled against the United States. Almost all of the wealthy planter class of the South had supported the Confederacy. Almost all of the people who owned large landed estates in the South had supported the rebellion against the Union. Some people argued the government should seize their land, break up the plantations into small plots of land, 40 acres, and distribute that land to the slaves, to the freed slaves. After all, the freed slaves had worked on this land, their families had worked on the land for generations. Didn't they rightfully have some claim to the land that their families had worked? And why would you return the land to people who had rebelled against the country? So there was an argument it would be just and fair to break up these large plantations and effectively distribute the land to the freed slaves, and that would give them a source of economic independence, essentially. There was an experiment in doing this. It was called Sherman's Land, after General Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman. William Tecumseh Sherman's army took control of a large swath of land along the coast of South Carolina, and under his orders, that land was distributed in 40-acre plots to freed slaves. He also distributed army mules to provide a source of sort of animal power for the farms as well. This is where the notion of 40 acres and a mule comes from. However, a few years later, President Andrew Johnson ordered that this land be returned to the planter class, to its original owners. So that experiment was short-lived, to say the least. And ultimately, all of the land was returned to the white planter class. This left African American freed persons without any land. They didn't have money, they didn't have land. Not all, but a majority were not literate. It had been illegal to teach slaves to read or write during slavery. Most had been farmers. This was the skill set that they had. They had worked in agriculture by and large. That was a majority, certainly. And the South itself was an agrarian economy. Its economy was rooted largely in the production of cotton. So what was this population to do? Many end up working as landless farmers. The freed persons, the free African Americans who had formerly been slaves, end up working as landless farmers. They end up working in a system known as sharecropping. It turned into a very abusive system. Under sharecropping, it involved both poor African Americans and some poor whites as well, I should say. Under the sharecropping system, landless farmers would agree to work on land that belonged to another person, a wealthy landowner. In return, they would receive provisions. They would receive seed, tools, clothing, food, and shelter. The landless farmers would receive this. They would work the land for the year, and in each growing season, there was an agreement that the landless farmers would split the resulting crop between themselves and the landowner. So whatever cotton was grown would be divided between the landowner and the people that worked the land. And then all of these provisions that had been provided, seed, tools, housing, food, clothing, etc., a record book would be kept of that. And out of the sharecropper's share of the crop, the expenses that they had accrued over the course of the year would be taken by the landowner. The system was abusive in that the landowners would charge incredibly exorbitant prices for all of these provisions that they provided to the sharecroppers, to the landless farmers. The landless farmers really didn't have any choice but to get their provisions from the landowners. They had no money. No one else was going to give them credit. So whatever they needed over the course of the year, they had to get it from the landowner on whose land they were working. And they had no choice but to pay these exorbitant prices in debt. And what happened over time was the sharecroppers found that they worked the land and they increasingly fell into debt, that they never made any money, and they became tied to the land. And it was a sort of system of quasi-slavery, if you will. They were working another person's land, and they never really saw any tangible money. Now, the whole system of Reconstruction comes to a crashing end in 1877. In 1877, there's a disputed election. No one really knows who won the presidential election in 1877. It's impossible to tell. It was too close to call. Florida and several other states, the vote was too close to determine who won, and therefore the election went to the House of Representatives. And here a rather terrible or horrible bargain was struck. The Democrats in Congress approached the Republicans in Congress with the following offer. The Democratic representatives in Congress said, "We will agree to vote for the Republican candidate for president, Rutherford B. Hayes. We will agree to give you, the Republicans, the presidency, if you, the Republicans, agree to end the occupation of the South, remove the federal troops from the South that have been there since 1865, the end of the Civil War, end the federal occupation of southern states." The Republicans agreed to this. Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, becomes president, and the federal occupation of southern states ends. What this means is Reconstruction itself is over. The southern states have been granted full sovereignty again, and there's nothing to stop southern whites from retaking power in the South and denying African Americans any rights that they've been granted effectively. It was always the Union Army that guaranteed African American rights in the South during Reconstruction. Everyone understood this. So without the Union Army, the Ku Klux Klan was able to become resurgent in the South, and they used terrorism to retake power. So in the elections following 1877, the Ku Klux Klan came out in force. They openly executed African Americans who were trying to vote. They would shoot people who were waiting in line, African Americans who were waiting in line to cast a vote, with rifles and pistols, and terrorize people and prevent them from casting a vote in places like Louisiana and Mississippi. And as a result, the Democratic Party won the elections. The Democrats retook control of all of the legislatures in the South in the late 1870s, early 1880s. The Republican Party was removed from power in the South. And the Democratic Party now passed a series of laws in the South that effectively stripped African Americans of all of their rights. How did they do this? Well, the 15th Amendment said you couldn't discriminate against a person on the basis of their race in voting. So you couldn't pass a law that simply said African Americans can't vote. What they did was they passed a series of laws that clearly were designed to achieve this purpose without stating it blatantly. One was a literacy test. You had to pass a literacy test proving you could read and write to vote. Well, of course, there are very low rates of literacy in the African American communities in the South because for decades it had been illegal to teach African Americans to read or write due to the history of slavery. And even African Americans who were literate, the tests were biased. All of the people giving the literacy test were white poll workers working for the Democratic Party, and they would give African Americans legal documents and documents in Latin to read for the literacy tests. Then they instituted a poll tax. You want to vote, you have to pay a $10 tax to cast a vote. Many African Americans, due to the long history of slavery, were impoverished. They didn't have access to cash. Sharecroppers almost never had money. Therefore, this disenfranchised many African Americans. And then they passed grandfather clauses, which said, if your grandfather could legally vote in the county, you don't have to pay the poll tax, and you don't have to take the literacy test. While most white men's grandfathers could legally vote in the county, but most African American men's grandfathers had been slaves who could not vote in the county. So effectively, whites didn't have to pay the poll tax, whites didn't have to take the literacy test, only African Americans did. So it effectively prevented African Americans from voting. You remember I mentioned 2 African American men were elected to the Senate from Mississippi? One was, the latter was elected in 1875 to the U.S. Senate from Mississippi. No, there won't be another African American elected to the U.S. Senate from any state in the Union until 1967, for almost 100 years. And that's because from the end of Reconstruction in 1877 until 1965, African Americans can't vote in the South for almost 100 years after the enactment of the 15th Amendment. African Americans can't vote in the South until the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So the last point I want to make, your paper, so it should be 5 to 6 pages double-spaced. The topic is wide open. You can send me an email if you want to ask a question about the topic. Any topic in American history from the founding of Jamestown in 1607 until the end of Reconstruction in 1877 can be a person, event, anything, really almost anything related to American history. You need a thesis or argument that you're going to present, some sort of claim, an argument that you're going to seek to prove. It's meant to be a persuasive essay. The directions can be found in Canvas. And you need to find a minimum of 5 sources. There are research databases available through the Hatch Library online. And of course, you can also use legitimate online sources as well. You can use your textbook as a source. Boundless can be used as a source as well. You can use also films on demand, online videos can be used as a source. So 5 sources that provide information about your topic, and use these sources to support your thesis, to support your argument in your essay. So it's a more formal and longer than a blog post. So it's a formal essay, it's more formal and longer than a blog post. You should have a formal thesis statement, formal argument that you're making. It's an open topic, you get to choose what you're writing about, and you need 5 sources. You should cite your sources, and it stipulates the MLA format, and you should provide a bibliography that lists your 5 sources as well. There are fairly detailed instructions in Canvas regarding the assignment. There's also a rubric in Canvas that outlines what I'll be looking for in the assignment. remember that your thesis statement should be some sort of arguable claim, some sort of contestable claim, an argument that you're seeking to make, something that you're trying to persuade me is true or to convince your audience of. You can think of your audience as being more than just myself, of course, but something that you're trying to convince the reader of. So I look forward to working with you this week, and thank you.